The plane was bustling with the usual sounds of passengers finding their seats, the soft hum of overhead compartments closing, and the gentle click of seat belts being fastened. It was a busy flight from New York to Los Angeles, and passengers were getting settled in for the journey ahead. Among the first-class passengers, a black CEO, known for his remarkable achievements in the tech world, had just found his seat. He was a calm, collected man who had been through many long flights in his career, so he was no stranger to the routines and sometimes stressful moments that came with air travel. He sat down, adjusting his jacket and getting comfortable. He was looking forward to a few hours of rest before his meeting in Los Angeles. The first-class cabin was quieter than the rest of the plane, offering a bit of luxury amidst the chaos of airport travel. Everything seemed normal at first, until a woman in her late 40s walked down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She paused in front of the CEO's seat, glanced at her ticket, and then at him. There was a brief moment of confusion on her face. The woman was clearly uncomfortable, but not ready to back down. Without hesitation, she spoke up, her voice louder than necessary for such a small issue. "Excuse me, but you're sitting in my seat," she said, pointing at the CEO's chair. Her tone was filled with an air of entitlement, as though she was expecting him to immediately vacate the spot without any question. The CEO, a little surprised but maintaining his calm demeanor, looked up and gently explained, "I believe this is my seat. Here is my boarding pass," holding it up for her to see. He pointed to the row and seat number that matched what was on the ticket. The woman didn't seem to listen. Instead, her frustration grew. She shook her head, clearly not willing to accept the situation. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she snapped, now raising her voice a little more. "I've paid for this seat, and you need to move. I don't know what's going on here, but you need to leave." The CEO, still calm, assured her, "I'm not going anywhere. This is my seat, and I have the correct ticket." He could tell that this was quickly becoming more than just a misunderstanding. It was turning into something much more personal. As he tried to de-escalate the situation, other passengers around the cabin began to notice the interaction. Some glanced over, sensing the tension. The woman wasn't backing down. Instead, her frustration seemed to be building as the seconds passed. She looked around the cabin for any sign of assistance, but no one seemed to be stepping in on her behalf. The flight attendants, hearing the raised voices, quickly approached, sensing that the situation might get out of hand. They were used to handling difficult passengers, but this seemed different. The woman's refusal to accept the situation was becoming more pronounced. The CEO, meanwhile, remained poised and composed, hoping that the flight attendants could resolve the matter swiftly and without further conflict. He didn't want the situation to escalate, but he also wasn't about to let the woman's demands overpower his right to the seat. The plane, already in motion, had its own rhythm. But now, in this small section of first class, an unexpected storm was brewing. The woman's voice grew louder, filled with impatience as she stood beside the CEO's seat, clearly unwilling to accept the reality of the situation. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if expecting someone, anyone, to support her claim. But to her frustration, no one came forward. The flight attendants were quickly approaching, sensing the growing tension in the air. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the attendants, a middle-aged woman with a calm, steady demeanor, said as she approached. She gave the woman a polite but firm look. "Is there a problem?" The woman's tone was sharp. "Yes, there is. This man is in my seat, and I've paid good money for this upgrade. I don't understand why he's sitting here. You need to make him move," she demanded, gesturing at the CEO as though he were the cause of all her discomfort. The flight attendant didn't flinch. She had dealt with many difficult passengers in her time, but this one seemed different. Instead of raising her own voice or getting flustered, she calmly turned to the CEO. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass for a moment?" she asked with a reassuring smile. The CEO nodded and handed her the ticket, which clearly showed that his seat was indeed in first class. The attendant glanced at the boarding pass, then at the woman, who was still standing there, arms crossed in defiance. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this is his seat," the flight attendant said gently but firmly, showing the woman the boarding pass. For a brief moment, the woman seemed to falter, her face flushing with embarrassment. But only for a moment. "I don't care about that," she snapped. "I've paid for this upgrade, and I'm not moving. You need to do something." The flight attendant maintained her calm, her voice still even. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but there is nothing we can do. This gentleman has the seat that corresponds to his ticket. I'll be happy to assist you in finding your correct seat, but we cannot ask him to leave his seat." The woman huffed in disbelief, shaking her head as if she couldn't quite grasp the fact that no one was siding with her. She looked back at the CEO, her eyes narrowing. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. Still, she was unwilling to back down completely. At this point, the other passengers were beginning to pay more attention to the unfolding drama. Some exchanged glances, while others tried to ignore the situation and mind their own business. A few even started to murmur amongst themselves, but most kept their focus on the crew, who were now trying to handle the disagreement with professionalism. The CEO sat silently, watching the woman's frustration mount, but his face remained neutral, his hands folded in his lap. He had dealt with all sorts of situations before in his career, but this was different. He knew he was right, but he wasn't about to let the tension ruin his flight. The flight attendant, never losing her composure, turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to please take your seat. We'll help you resolve this, but the seat you're looking for is not here," she said with quiet authority. The woman stood still for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each breath. It was clear she was weighing her options, but her anger was hard to hide. The quiet murmurs from other passengers were growing louder, and she knew she was losing control of the situation. Her eyes flicked from the flight attendant to the CEO, and then back again. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping slightly in defeat. But even then, she wasn't willing to fully let go of her anger. She muttered something under her breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Unbelievable," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Despite the tension in the air, the flight attendants held their ground. The woman, now visibly frustrated, finally gave in and moved to an empty seat in economy class, her steps slow and reluctant. The CEO, relieved that the situation had been diffused without further incident, settled back into his seat, trying to push the unpleasant encounter out of his mind. For a moment, the cabin fell back into its usual rhythm. But the discomfort of the earlier exchange lingered, and passengers couldn't help but reflect on the drama that had unfolded before them. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about something much deeper, a clash of expectations, pride, and a sense of entitlement. And for the woman, it was a lesson that she wouldn't soon forget. As the woman finally walked down the aisle toward her assigned seat in economy, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin returned to a quiet calm. But the tension hadn't completely disappeared. The flight attendants, though experienced, exchanged a brief glance. They had seen difficult situations before, but this one had been different, more intense, more personal. They knew it wasn't just about a simple seating error. It was about pride, expectations, and an unwillingness to accept the situation. The woman's departure had made the cabin feel a little more relaxed, but some passengers were still looking around, whispering quietly to each other. A few even glanced at the CEO, wondering how he was handling the situation. He sat back in his seat, adjusting his tie, and gazing out the window, as if he hadn't been involved in the drama at all. His calm demeanor was impressive, especially considering the woman's rude behavior. The flight attendants, after making sure that all the other passengers were settled in and the situation had calmed down, returned to their duties. One of them, a tall woman with short black hair, approached the CEO, her voice soft but full of respect. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for handling that so gracefully. I know it wasn't easy. The CEO smiled politely. It wasn't a problem. I just wanted to keep things calm. The flight attendant nodded. We appreciate that. Sometimes passengers forget that we're all here to help each other. They get so wrapped up in their own expectations that they forget to see the bigger picture. The CEO glanced toward the back of the plane where the woman was now seated, her body stiff with frustration as she looked out the window. He didn't say anything for a moment, just observed her. It was clear to him that this wasn't about the seat. It was about something deeper, something more personal. He understood that, but he wasn't about to let her behavior influence how he carried himself. I understand, the CEO finally replied, his voice calm and measured. It's just unfortunate that some people let their egos get in the way of simple situations, but that's on them, not us. The flight attendant nodded in agreement. Exactly. We're just here to keep things running smoothly. Meanwhile, other passengers were still talking about the incident, though in hushed tones. Some were sympathetic toward the CEO, while others seemed to side with the woman, not understanding why she had been so insistent on the matter. Regardless of which side they took, it was clear that the situation had disrupted the flow of the flight. But as the flight continued, the cabin slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The overhead lights dimmed, and the soft hum of the airplane engines became a comforting background noise. The woman in economy, still visibly upset, had become more subdued as the flight went on. Her anger had fizzled out, leaving her with only the sting of embarrassment. She had not expected the crew, and especially the CEO, to remain so calm. Her usual tactics of entitlement and forceful demands had not worked. The CEO, on the other hand, settled in for the flight, knowing that this brief moment would soon be forgotten. He was used to such encounters, even if they didn't happen often. He knew how to navigate situations like this, focusing on the bigger picture and not letting small disturbances derail his peace of mind. The crew had done their part, and now the flight could continue smoothly, much to the relief of everyone involved. As the hours passed, the cabin slowly returned to normal. The hum of conversations, the clinking of coffee cups, and the steady movement of the flight attendants brought a sense of calm back to the passengers. But in the back of the plane, the woman's thoughts were still racing. She couldn't help but replay the incident in her mind, now realizing that her behavior had been over the top. Deep down, she knew she had misjudged the situation, and perhaps herself. The flight might have continued as planned, but for her, the memory of the incident would linger long after the plane landed. As the flight continued, the CEO leaned back in his seat, trying to relax. He looked out the window at the clouds below, his mind drifting, but he couldn't help but think about the incident that had just occurred. He wasn't the type to hold grudges, but the woman's attitude had bothered him. Her sense of entitlement, her unwillingness to listen, and the way she had treated him all rubbed him the wrong way. Yet, as the leader of a large company, he had learned over the years that maintaining composure in such situations was often the best way to handle things. In the world of business, there were plenty of moments where you had to deal with difficult people, whether they were clients, employees, or even strangers. He had faced far more challenging situations than this, and yet, the woman's approach had felt different. She hadn't simply been demanding. She had been dismissive, expecting the world to bend to her will without considering anyone else. He knew, of course, that people like her existed, but it was always a reminder that humility and respect for others mattered more than titles or status. He took a deep breath, shaking off the thoughts. There was no use in dwelling on the past, especially when it came to something as trivial as a seat on a plane. Still, the interaction had left him with something to think about. He knew the woman's actions weren't just about the seat. It was a sign of something deeper, a reflection of how some people saw themselves and how they thought others should see them. The flight attendant who had spoken to him earlier returned to check on him, her expression warm and friendly. "Is everything all right, sir? I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable after everything that happened." The CEO smiled, nodding. "Everything's fine. Thank you for handling that so professionally." The flight attendant shrugged slightly, looking down the aisle where the woman was sitting in economy. It's all part of the job. But I have to admit, it's not every day we have a passenger cause such a scene in first class. He chuckled softly. I can imagine. You handled it well, though. The flight attendant smiled. We try, but sometimes you just have to be firm, you know. The CEO nodded thoughtfully. He appreciated how the staff had dealt with the situation calmly and without escalating things. It was a reminder of the importance of staying composed, no matter what happened around you. He had always believed in the power of grace under pressure, and today had been another example of why that principle mattered. As the flight continued, the cabin lights dimmed, signaling that it was time for the passengers to settle in for the long haul. Many of the passengers were already dozing off or getting comfortable for the flight, but the woman in economy remained wide awake, her mind clearly racing. The CEO could see her occasionally glancing up from her seat, her eyes flicking toward the first-class cabin. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking now. Was she regretting how she had acted? Was she embarrassed by the scene she had caused? Or was she too proud to admit any fault? The CEO had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Her reaction to the situation had been a reflection of her own insecurities, not his actions. Despite her behavior earlier, he didn't feel anger toward her, just a kind of quiet understanding. He realized that people like her often acted out of a need to prove something, to assert themselves in ways that often hurt others. He had seen it before, both in the business world and in everyday life. In a way, he almost felt sorry for her, though he knew better than to let that pity show. The flight slowly settled into its rhythm. The crew moved quietly through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, while the passengers seemed to relax, finding their own moments of peace in the air. The CEO closed his eyes for a moment, his thoughts drifting away from the earlier confrontation. There was no use in letting it spoil the rest of the flight. He had a busy schedule ahead, and he needed to be rested for the meetings awaiting him in Los Angeles. Still, as the hours passed, he couldn't help but reflect on the woman's actions, on the entitlement and anger she had displayed. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how calm or composed you tried to be, there would always be people who sought conflict, who believed the world should bend to their desires. But he had learned to let those things go, to rise above them, and focus on the things that truly mattered. As the plane soared through the sky, he knew that he had done just that. As the flight moved further along, the cabin settled into a more peaceful rhythm. Passengers had adjusted to the situation, and most had either fallen asleep or were engrossed in their personal activities. The flight attendants continued to do their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, ensuring everyone was comfortable. The CEO, now fully relaxed, pulled out his tablet and began reviewing some documents for his upcoming meetings. His mind, however, wasn't entirely focused on work. Every now and then, he would glance over toward the woman in economy, who was still seated near the back, her body stiff as she stared out the window. She hadn't looked up once since the earlier confrontation. Her face, which had been filled with so much frustration and anger before, now seemed distant, lost in thought. He couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she reflecting on the way she had behaved? Did she regret how she had treated him and the flight attendants? Or was she too proud to admit any wrong? The CEO knew that people often acted out of insecurity or pride, but he also understood that it could take a great deal of self-awareness to recognize when you were in the wrong. It was possible that the woman hadn't yet come to that realization. He could sense, though, that the encounter had left her shaken. Her earlier outbursts seemed less like the actions of someone confident in their position, and more like the reaction of someone who was struggling with something deeper. Meanwhile, the flight attendants were continuing to work quietly, moving through the aisles with practiced ease. They had all seen their fair share of difficult passengers over the years, but this situation had felt different. It wasn't just about handling an angry person. It had been about maintaining calm in the face of tension, about making sure the flight could continue smoothly. The flight attendants had risen to the challenge, and their professionalism had not gone unnoticed by the passengers. One of the flight attendants, a young man with a friendly smile, walked up to the CEO as he was finishing up a document on his tablet. "Is everything going all right, sir?" he asked politely. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're comfortable." The CEO looked up from his tablet and smiled, grateful for the gesture. "Everything's fine, thank you. You've all been very professional today." The flight attendant nodded. "We do our best. I hope the rest of the flight is smooth for you." The CEO returned to his work, but his thoughts still drifted back to the woman in economy. He had seen people like her before in his career, people who believed their status and wealth made them entitled to special treatment. They often struggled to understand why others wouldn't simply defer to them. But he also knew that such people often had their own insecurities. The woman's outburst had been a reflection of something deeper, something personal. Maybe she felt that the world owed her something, or maybe she was just used to getting her way. He could almost feel a sense of sympathy for her, despite her earlier behavior. It wasn't easy to face the truth about yourself, especially when it meant admitting that you had been wrong. He wondered whether the woman would come to realize that she had misjudged the situation, that her behavior had been out of line. But as the flight progressed, the CEO decided it wasn't his place to dwell on her actions any longer. He had a busy day ahead in Los Angeles, and he knew that he needed to be focused and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. So he pushed the thoughts aside and shifted his attention back to his work. The hours passed, and the plane soared higher into the sky, leaving the earlier tension behind. The woman in economy, still deep in thought, had begun to relax slightly, her posture less rigid. She glanced up a few times, looking toward the first-class cabin, but she said nothing to the flight attendants or anyone else around her. It seemed as though she had decided to keep to herself for the remainder of the journey. For the CEO, it was a reminder that every encounter had its own lessons, and not every situation required a reaction. Sometimes, the best thing to do was simply to let things unfold, knowing that everything would work out in the end. The woman's actions had been disruptive, but now it was time for everyone to move forward and focus on the rest of the flight. As the hours passed, the flight slowly approached its destination. The gentle hum of the plane's engines had become a familiar background sound, lulling many passengers into a sense of calm. The CEO, who had been working diligently on his documents, felt the weight of the long flight starting to catch up with him. He leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms above his head as he glanced at the overhead monitors showing their distance from Los Angeles. Just a few more hours, he thought, and then he would be back on solid ground, ready to tackle the challenges ahead. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the earlier incident. It wasn't that he was upset, rather, he was curious. The woman's behavior had been puzzling, especially given how unrelenting she had been in trying to force him out of his seat. For a moment, he wondered if there was more to her than he had seen. Maybe there was something in her life that had shaped her sense of entitlement, something that made her feel like she had the right to demand whatever she wanted. But then he realized it didn't really matter. People were going to act the way they chose, and while it was frustrating to deal with, there was no point in trying to analyze or fix it. The best course of action was to stay true to his own values, respect, patience, and professionalism, and let others figure things out for themselves. As the CEO settled back into his seat, he noticed the woman in economy was still sitting quietly, her eyes glued to the window. Her earlier anger had melted away, but her body language was still tense, as though she was lost in thought. There was a look of deep concentration on her face, as if she were reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He couldn't help but wonder if she was regretting her actions, or perhaps coming to terms with her behavior. The flight attendants had mostly finished their rounds, and now the cabin was quiet, with only the occasional sound of a passenger shifting in their seat. The cabin lights were dimmed, and the soft chatter that had filled the air earlier had quieted down. Most passengers were now either reading, watching movies, or attempting to catch up on sleep. The atmosphere had returned to its usual calm, and the tension from earlier had all but dissipated. The CEO glanced down the aisle again, his eyes briefly meeting the woman's. For a split second, he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she was acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. It was a fleeting moment, and before he could react, she turned her gaze back toward the window. Maybe she was processing what had happened. Maybe she was embarrassed by her earlier behavior. Or maybe, like most people, she simply wanted to move past it and forget the entire episode. Whatever the case, the CEO didn't dwell on it. He knew that life was full of these small, often insignificant moments. The key was how you chose to react to them. As the flight neared its final descent into Los Angeles, the cabin began to stir once again. The seatbelt signs flashed on, and the flight attendants moved through the aisle to make sure everyone was securely fastened. The woman in economy, still silent, gathered her things and started preparing for landing. Her earlier frustrations seemed to have faded, replaced by a more reserved demeanor. The CEO followed suit, putting away his tablet and adjusting his seat. He had learned long ago that no matter how strange or uncomfortable a situation might be, it was always better to stay focused on the bigger picture. The world had a way of sorting itself out, and people's actions, no matter how jarring or upsetting, were often less important than they seemed in the moment. As the plane made its descent, the CEO looked out the window, ready for the next chapter of his journey. He knew that the flight had been an odd, unexpected experience, but in the grand scheme of things, it was just another story to add to the collection of his travels. Life went on, and the sky, vast and endless, seemed to remind him that no matter what happened, the world kept moving forward. As the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, the CEO felt a wave of relief wash over him. The long flight was finally over, and the bustling energy of the airport greeted him as he gathered his belongings. He glanced out the window as the plane taxied toward the gate, feeling the familiar excitement of being back in the city. For him, Los Angeles was a place full of opportunity, a place where everything seemed possible. But before he could let his mind fully focus on his upcoming meetings, a brief thought about the woman in economy crossed his mind. He wondered what had been going through her head when the flight had ended. Had she fully processed her actions? Had she understood how out of line she had been? Or was she still too caught up in her pride to reflect on what had happened? The CEO didn't know, and to be honest, he didn't dwell on it for long. He was a man who had learned to focus on the things he could control and let go of the rest. His job was to keep his own course steady, regardless of the distractions that might come his way. Still, as he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he couldn't help but feel a slight sense of curiosity about how the woman would move forward from this incident. For some, moments like these served as wake-up calls, a chance to reflect and change their behavior. For others, they simply moved on without giving it much thought. He had seen it in the business world before, where individuals either learned from their mistakes or refused to acknowledge them. Either way, it wasn't his place to intervene. The CEO's next priority was to get through customs and head to the waiting car that would take him to his next meeting. As he walked through the terminal, his mind shifted back to work. He was preparing for a series of important discussions, negotiations that could significantly impact the future of his company. His focus had to be sharp, his decisions calculated. But as he made his way through the crowded terminal, he noticed something interesting. The woman who had caused the earlier disruption was ahead of him, walking with purpose through the crowd. She was alone now, no longer surrounded by the aura of entitlement that had marked her earlier behavior. She looked different, more grounded, perhaps a bit more humble. There was no sign of the anger or frustration that had been so apparent on the plane. The CEO couldn't help but observe her from a distance, trying to gauge her demeanor. It wasn't his business, of course, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. Maybe she had taken a moment to reflect on her actions, or perhaps she had simply decided that it wasn't worth carrying the weight of her frustration any longer. Whatever the case, the CEO didn't approach her. He had learned long ago that some encounters were best left in the past. People would come and go, and the world would continue spinning. He didn't need to confront her or offer any advice. What mattered was how each person chose to move forward. As he exited the terminal and walked toward his car, the noise of the airport faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of the city. The woman, he noticed, had disappeared into the crowd, her figure now just another face in the sea of passengers. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that whatever had happened between them on the plane, it was over. It was time to move on. He climbed into his waiting car, settling into the back seat as the driver pulled away from the curb. His focus was now entirely on the day ahead. Meetings, decisions, and negotiations awaited him. But as the car merged into traffic, he couldn't help but think back to the flight, to the way the woman had acted, and how, in the end, she had likely realized that her demands hadn't changed anything. In the business world, and in life, people often believe that they could control everything. But in truth, it was only the way you responded to situations that truly mattered. And today, the CEO had shown that, no matter how difficult the moment, it was always better to maintain composure and stay true to one's values. In the end, that was all that really mattered. As the CEO's car drove smoothly through the busy streets of Los Angeles, he leaned back in his seat, letting the calm of the ride wash over him. The noise and activity of the airport were now behind him, replaced by the steady rhythm of the city around him. His mind was focused on the day ahead, important meetings, negotiations, and decisions that would shape the future of his company. Yet, despite the weight of his responsibilities, his thoughts occasionally drifted back to the earlier encounter on the plane. The incident had left an impression on him, not because it had been dramatic or heated, but because it had been a reminder of how people interacted with one another in moments of stress or discomfort. He had seen so many different types of people in his career, from those who handled pressure with grace to those who let their egos get the best of them. The woman on the flight, with her initial demands and frustration, was clearly someone who had felt wronged, yet he couldn't help but wonder what had motivated her to react that way. There was a lesson in the situation, one that went beyond the inconvenience of sharing a seat. It was about understanding that everyone carried their own burdens, their own struggles, and their own pressures. Sometimes, people acted out of fear, insecurity, or a need to assert control when they felt they were losing it. The CEO knew this well, especially in his line of work, where high stakes and intense competition could bring out the worst in some people. But he also knew that how you responded to others, especially in difficult situations, spoke volumes about your character. He thought about the flight attendant who had managed the situation with such professionalism. Her calm demeanor had diffused the tension, and the way she had stood firm without escalating the confrontation had been a true testament to her skill. In that moment, the CEO had learned something valuable, not just about the flight attendants or the woman on the plane, but about how he could continue to refine his own approach to challenges. It wasn't enough to simply react to the world. Sometimes, it was about choosing to act in a way that reflected your values, even when others didn't. As the car made its way toward his office building, the CEO reflected on the broader picture. His job, his life, and even that small interaction on the plane were all part of a larger story, a journey of learning, growing, and evolving. He understood that every person he encountered had something to teach him, whether it was a lesson in patience, understanding, or resilience. Even when faced with people who seemed difficult or entitled, there was always something to gain from the experience. Arriving at his destination, the CEO stepped out of the car, ready to face the day. He had already made up his mind to tackle the challenges ahead with the same level of calm and focus he had maintained during the flight. He had learned to let go of small frustrations, to not let the actions of others define his day. As he entered the building and walked toward the elevators, he felt a sense of peace. The earlier events on the plane had faded into the background, replaced by the bigger goals he had set for himself. The woman and economy had long since left his thoughts, but the lesson from their brief interaction remained. It wasn't about winning or losing, about who was right or wrong. It was about how you handled the moment, how you chose to rise above the tension, and how you let your values guide your actions. The elevator doors closed behind him, and as the car began its ascent, the CEO took a deep breath. He was ready for the day, prepared to handle whatever came his way. The world, with all its challenges, was full of opportunities, and he was determined to face each one with grace, humility, and focus. No matter what had happened on the plane, he knew that he had made the right choice by staying calm and professional. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.